What do you know about Japan's participation in World War II? Many people know that in 1945, exactly 3 months after the defeat of Nazi Germany, the USSR declared war on militaristic Japan. Soon, Japan capitulated. The USSR put a fat point in World War II by defeating Hitler's accomplices, the Empire of Japan. Unfairly little is told these days about Japan's militarism and participation in the war on Hitler's side. We know about the atrocities of the German atrocities, but why does no one mention the Japanese? We are proud that the Red Army broke the back of the Third Reich and Germany capitulated. But how many people know that the Red Army did not end the war in May 1945, but continued to fight together with the Allies until the complete defeat of the Japanese militarists? The day of the end of World War is recognized as September 2. It was on that day that the Japanese Empire laid down its arms, recognized its defeat, and signed the surrender document. What is the role of Japan in that war? What the Japanese soldiers did when they occupied the territories, how they treated the prisoners, and what was going on behind the barbed wire of concentration camps you will learn from this article. How and when the Japanese started the war. It was 1945. On September 2 at 9 a.m., the American battleship Missouri stood still in Tokyo Bay. Seagulls broke the silence, and the coastal waves beat against the sides of the ship as if they wanted to move it from its place. How could they know how much important action was taking place on the battleship? On the deck were present representatives of high military officials of all Allied countries in the fight against Japan. On the Japanese side, Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Yoshijiro Umezu were signing the act. Today, General Umezu was not distinguished by his military bearing. His shoulders were slumped. Slouching, he strode leisurely across the deck toward total failure, trial, and life imprisonment. There were other times in his life. In 1937, when Japan attacked China, the Chinese consider this year to be the beginning of World War. Japan's goal was to overthrow the ruling coalition, establish its puppet regime, and completely subjugate China to Japan. China was to become, according to the Japanese elite, a colony of Japan. Yoshijiro was deputy minister and in 1938, commander of the Japanese army in China. All the worst crimes against the people of China were committed under the leadership of this subhuman. The Japanese-Chinese War lasted 7 years until the complete surrender of the country of the rising sun. Japanese aggression claimed the lives of millions of Chinese, and even more were orphaned and disabled. During the Japanese-Chinese War, 11 million military and about 20 million Chinese civilians died. Most of them were tortured in concentration camps, laboratories, burned and shot. Horrifying figures. The flag of the rising sun is flying in support of the Third Reich. And at the same time, on the other side of the continent, strengthened 2 more dragon heads, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. They were united with the Japanese dragon head by the pact signed in Berlin in 1940. It was the Triple Pact. That's what it was called. From that moment, Japan entered World War II and became an ally of Nazism and Fascism. Japan differed from its allies in only one way: the degree of brutality. Yes, the Japanese were even more brutal in their treatment of prisoners of war and civilians in the occupied territories. What the Japanese did in the occupied territories. Residents of Western Europe were terrified of the flag with swastika, and the inhabitants of Korea, China, and other Asian countries were covered with cold sweat if a flag with the image of a solar disk surrounded by rays appeared on the horizon. The fact that Japan violated all the laws of warfare and all her war crimes have long been proven. These include mass brutal murders, medical experiments on people. A lot of Japanese military confessed to their crimes, and in 1950s of the last century, the Japanese government made a lot of apologies for the atrocities committed by their country. The Japanese Foreign Ministry has stated that the state is fully aware of its role in causing terrible suffering and tragedy during the WW2. In the occupied territories, the Japanese built the same concentration camps as the Nazis. Tens of thousands passed through these factories of death, Almost for all of them, there was no way out of these camps. Nothing prevented Japan from committing atrocities. Militarists did not sign the Geneva Convention in 1929, so they did terrible things to prisoners of war. Neither Japan's own military law nor the Hague Conventions prevented the atrocities. In 2017, the London media circulated photos of POWs in concentration camps. The images were kept in archives and used as evidence in courts against militarist criminals. The photos are silent witnesses to the horrors that took place behind barbed wire. Unsanitary conditions, dilapidated barracks, starving Asian and European prisoners. Many of the captives were pictured with amputated limbs and body parts. There were also shots of inhuman torture. History has also captured the faces of the guards. Some of the wardens did not remain mere shadows of the times in the photograph, but became world famous for their cruelty and sadism. For example, Officer Yusuke, nicknamed the Black Prince. He worked as a warden in a camp whose prisoners were building a railroad in Burma. Another subhuman is Sergeant Okada, nicknamed Dr. Death, who was famous for his sophisticated torture. Each of the images clearly shows what happened to people after starvation, torture, and harsh working conditions. This railroad connecting Burma and Bangkok stretches more than 400 kilometers. During its construction, more than 100,000 prisoners of the camps died, unable to withstand disease, hunger, cruelty of the guards. The Japanese used the labor of prisoners in the most difficult areas of work in coal mines, industrial plants, shipyards. The lives of people were not protected. In place of thousands of dead, more and more unfortunate people arrived. Stations of comfort that mutilated tens of thousands of lives. Incredibly tragic was the fate of every girl and woman who was destined to be born Asian and fall into the Japanese occupation. Tens of thousands of young girls died, and the fate of many more was mutilated. In the occupied territories of Asian countries, the Japanese command, in addition to concentration camps for prisoners, established comfort stations for Japanese soldiers. Such stations were constantly replenished with young girls, most of whom were minors. Girls were taken captive in the occupied territories, taken away from their homes by deception, promising to arrange them for work, education. In reality, the women were forced to provide sexual services to soldiers. Everyday minors were abused more than 10 times. On weekends, each girl had to serve about 50 soldiers. Some could not stand it. The girls begged the soldiers for pain pills, stole opium, and collected medicines in large quantities to end their lives. There were other ways for desperate captive girls to commit suicide. The more territory the Japanese occupied, the more such brothels were needed. Over time, girls began to be brought from Indonesian internment camps. Filipino women also became sex slaves. There were also European women among the captives. How many girls suffered, died, were raped, there is no exact data. Post-war studies show that the figure ranges up to 300,000. Every day captured slave girls were examined by doctors. They found out if the girl had contracted venereal diseases because no contraceptives were supposed to be used. If the captive was infected and became pregnant, she was prescribed a drug, which was administered by force. The consequences of its use were the most severe. Girls died, became infertile, remained disabled. Unit number 731. These three numbers caused horror among the prisoners who heard them. The Japanese themselves call Unit 731 a black stain on the land of the rising sun. The year of the unit's creation was 1932. For the first time, it was located 20 kilometers from Harbin. The first subjects were captured Chinese prisoners of war. The leader was Ishii Shiro, a war criminal, maniac, animal abuser, and microbiologist by education. 731 was established for research in biology. The Japanese decided to create biological weapons at all costs and direct them against the USSR, China, and Mongolia. World domination did not let the militaristic Japan sleep peacefully, neither day nor night. It was for this purpose that Squad 731 began to work hard. The secret complex was built in a specially selected location. The settlement was not an obstacle to construction. The Japanese simply burned down a village of 300 houses, along with the people, and built the structure. Not only prisoners of war, but also civilians from the occupied territories became subjects. They were driven to the camps of Unit 731, sometimes en masse, together with their families, neighbors, relatives. Whole villages and streets were taken there. The experiments consumed people very quickly. New logs were needed every week, and they were supplied in full. The wardens called people thrown into the millstones of inhuman experiments logs. People were tortured not only to create bacteriological weapons, but also for other purposes. Animals were subjected to experiments aimed at finding out the limits of human organisms' endurance in the most severe conditions. They also tested medicines on living people, placed a person in a non-viable environment and observed the reaction of the organism, conducted various surgical operations. Few people know what the Khabarovsk trial is. It is called the Eastern Nuremberg. In 1949 in Khabarovsk, there was a trial of 12 Japanese criminals, whom the USSR accused of trying to create bacteriological weapons and inhuman experiments on people. All of them were sentenced to terms from 15 to 25 years. In 1993, Russia began an inspection of the Khabarovsk case. After the audit, the Russian prosecutor's office refused to rehabilitate the convicted criminals, and the Russian Supreme Court upheld this decision.